Welcome back to Dispatch Faith. I'm your host, Michael Reneau. Joining me this week is Matthew Lee Anderson, an assistant professor in the honors program at Baylor University and associate director of the Baylor in Washington program. He's also the author of two books, Earthen Vessels, Why Our Bodies Matter to Our Faith, and Called into Questions, Cultivating the Love of Learning Within the Life of Faith. And it's actually, as I understand it, Matt, a pretty substantial revision of a previous book, so maybe that makes you the author of three books. I don't know. But Matt's also been a prolific author elsewhere, including for us at the Dispatch, having written a couple of pieces dealing with the pro-life movement in the last few months, and is also the founder of Mere Orthodoxy, a Christian online magazine. Matt, thanks for joining me today. Looking forward to a conversation in which we talk about nothing thorny or prickly at all with discussing the pro-life movement in the year 2024.
I know how to make myself very popular. I only take up the easy questions. Michael, it's great to be here. I'm really glad to be on.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we'll get to those easy questions real quick, just because I did stumble over that a little bit. Called into Questions, I mean, is a pretty substantial revision of the End of Our Exploring, which you wrote several years ago, right? Is that kind of how you've couched it?
Yeah, it's substantial enough that I think of it as a new book. The question is, you have all these people who are deconstructing, to use that language, and what do we do with them? How do we actually incorporate questions into our Christian communities as a way of helping form people so that they don't end up deconstructing? That was the burden of Called into Questions. I loved writing it, rewriting it. I think it's a wonderful little book, if I may say so myself. I think I have to say so myself. If authors don't say that about their own books, no one else will. So I really had a great time writing it. It's a fun little project.
All right, so let the record show then that Matthew Lee Anderson is the author of three books, not two or two.
There's actually a fourth out there, Michael, which is new, but no one's going to read that one, which is called Confidence in Life, a Bardian account of procreation. And that is I only mention it because it actually touches on themes that we might get into today. It's a theological account of why people should have babies. So it's a revision of my dissertation published by T&T Clark early in January of this year. So it's big, and it costs $90 or something like that. So it's not a bestseller, and there's no reason why you should have known about that. But it is actually a fourth book that exists under my name.
Four books. Yeah, well. We'll definitely be touching on some of those topics right now. So yeah, having Matt on to talk about the pro-life movement, kind of where the movement is in 2024. We're now in the very kind of last stages of a presidential campaign in which feels like a lot of the questions, the sorts of questions that we have talked about, we meaning journalists, commentators, et cetera, over the last 25, 30 years are now different and turned on their heads a bit. Before we jump into some of the kind of nitty-gritty aspects of this, I guess, Matt, first question to kind of shed some light on where you're coming from. And again, you've written two pieces for us in the last three or so months about this. When we talk about the pro-life movement, I think there's a tendency to think about it as merely a political movement, merely a political arm. That's certainly the part of the movement that gets a lot of headlines and media of all sorts, I guess. I would, push back on that kind of conception of the movement and say there's a lot more to it. But as we stand in October 2024, again, Roe is gone. Dobbs is now the law of the land. You've got this context, this atmosphere in which several states have really voted down pro-life measures in the last couple of years. If Matt Anderson were kind of the engineer of the pro-life movement right now, what would that look like in the different levels, and what would its mission be, or how would it be, I guess, transacting its mission, if that makes sense?
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't think anyone wants me to be the architect of the movement, and I'm quite sure I don't have the capacity or skill to think at that level really effectively. But you're absolutely right. Dobbs changed everything for the pro-life movement. And when you talk about it's not only a political movement, I think that's all exactly right. The pro-life movement has done all sorts of work in local communities to support mothers, to crisis pregnancy centers and the like. They've built outreach operations to persuade American citizens that human life begins at conception, and all of that is downstream from upstream from politics, I guess we should say. I think if we look at sustained democratic movements in American history, along with the temperance movement, the civil rights movement, the pro-life movement is one of the most significant, sustained democratic initiatives that we have had. And the only way you can have the type of success and effect that the pro-life movement has had is by focusing well beyond the ballot box, by focusing well beyond legislation, and trying to build systems and structures for people that move them into the type of life that you want them to have. And the pro-life movement, I think, has done that very effectively. But Dobbs changes everything, right? Like it's a new thing. Having Roe no longer be the law of the land, I think, is an opportunity for the movement to rethink some of how it's approaching politics, particularly. And I think if I had to design the movement, at least the political wing, I think I'd say something like the state-by-state approach is a very reasonable approach to take. There's all sorts of people in this country who were only vaguely persuaded that human life begins at conception, or that abortion should be restricted after, say, the first trimester, right? Like, while opinion polls were fairly comforting pre-Dobbs on that, that doesn't really capture the degree of intensity or the level of conviction about those types of positions once it comes to actually imposing those sorts of restrictions. And when Dobbs goes and it becomes real, you have to start making a decision. Who are we going to restrict? How are we going to restrict people from getting abortions? All of a sudden, the stakes go up for those votes. And what seemed like really popular positions turned out to be less popular than we need to actually win at the ballot box. And so I think my general stance is, in doubling down on policies that support working class women through expanded family leave. I like the J.D. Vance sort of approach to reducing the cost of birth. Liz Brunig actually had a make birth free policy that she put forward, and I think that's really interesting, and we should try to figure out how to do that. Lowering the costs of having children seems to me to be a really significant way of trying to get at the abortion debate sideways, by sort of taking the pressure off of working class families who, when they have a child that's unexpected, might be tempted to seek abortion because it's economically hard to have another child. If we can take away those sorts of burdens, then we might be able to reduce the pressure in the abortion debate in certain ways. But I think when it comes to restrictions, and we have to take that state by state. We just do. The reality is that a national level restriction on abortion is a non-starter politically. And I take that as just the facts of the ground. I don't like it. Wish we weren't there, but we seem to be there. And so from my standpoint, trying to chip away in states that are friendly, but in ways that are also conducive to supporting maternal health, in order to show, actually, if we restrict abortions, it doesn't lead to the type of nightmare scenarios that we're regularly accused of causing by restricting abortions. If we can actually build up evidence that that's the case, then I think we could make progress at the national level 20 to 30 years from now. But I'm not optimistic that it'll happen anytime sooner than that.
So a couple of things, I mean, you didn't just allude to them, you kind of said them outright, that right now politically, it's just not politically feasible, I guess, to enact some of the restrictions that someone like you, or someone like me too. I mean, I think most of us at the Dispatch are not everybody, but most of us are pretty clear about being, generally fairly pro-life on lots of these issues. But that politically, it's just not feasible because, I mean, the electorate, society, however you want to phrase it, is just not there. And some of the stuff you've written for us, you've referenced kind of social liberalization, one way to put it. I guess one question as you look back at the last, I don't know, 10 years, 15 years, whatever, do you think Dobbs sort of, when it comes to abortion politics, hastened some of the social liberalization that you have referred to in writing for us, or do you think that that was somewhat inevitable, just as the way that American society is going?
Yeah, it's hard to tell. I think it was probably inevitable. I mean, once you take away liberties that people think they have, they're going to react against that. And so whether you took away Dobbs 20 years ago or excuse me, took away Roe 20 years ago or took it away, when we did, I think you're going to have a backlash because Americans dispositionally love their rights. We love our freedoms. And if you are perceived as taking freedoms away, that's a net negative. Kind of doesn't matter what those freedoms are. Right. And so I think in one respect, the liberalization on this issue was baked in. Once we granted the basically unmitigated right to abortion, any attempt to take that back was going to paint you as the baddie for American society. Right. And that's just seems inevitable. But at the same time, we have had over the last 10, 15 years, a really significant social liberalization on other issues, right? Gay marriage has gone forward. There's a sense in which in all of those other types of issues, I think especially the gay marriage debate, those who were perceived as being on the right, socially conservative, became very low status people. I think this is one thing that people don't realize. It's low status to be ardently pro-life. If you are, so if you're in an elite context and you say, I'm really ardently pro-life, elites kind of downrank you. They look down on you. They move you into another class. And I think that that's really significant for the politics of the pro-life movement because it's hard to win a really broad consensus on an issue if the people at the forefront are regarded by much of society as being low status. The other side of it is that working class folks, I think, are more sympathetic to abortion rights and abortion access than middle class conservatives, in part because they have seen the extraordinary burdens of unwanted children firsthand. And so I think they're a little more open to being socially liberal on abortion and more concerned about economic policies. And so the standard Trump voter who's working class, who feels disenfranchised, alienated from the government, I don't think they're particularly pro-life. And so that combination where you have pro-life views being low status views and the low status people that Trump has really effectively won, not being especially pro-life, that just makes pro-life politics dead on arrival almost in American society, just as it is. It makes the effort to restrict abortion access done. And so I think the reaction to Roe falling was built in, but I do think there are these other social economic forces that are peculiar to our time that we've seen over the last 15, 20 years that have made this worse than it would be otherwise.
Yeah. Again, like this will be a perennial issue when it comes to elections and talking about how all this plays out in elections. This election cycle has been quite a bit
Wild.
different. Yeah, to put it mildly. And I want to Victoria, if you can, to cue up a clip from the vice presidential debate that took place on October 1st. There was about a 10-minute chunk of that debate in which Tim Walz and JD Vance were discussing abortion. And there are a couple different parts of this, but JD Vance kind of goes on an opening salvo and talking about one of the things that's different, I guess, with this election, which is he just seems to be voicing a desire to try to bridge areas of trust that have kind of been breached, I guess, in years past, is maybe how he would put it. I'll let him speak, but Matt, just interested for your reaction after he talks here.
No, Nora, certainly we won't. And I want to talk about this issue because I know a lot of Americans care about it, and I know a lot of Americans don't agree with everything that I've ever said on this topic. And, I grew up in a working class family in a neighborhood where I knew a lot of young women who had unplanned pregnancies and decided to terminate those pregnancies because they feel like they didn't have any other options. And, you know, one of them is actually very dear to me. And I know she's watching tonight, and I love you. And she told me something a couple years ago that she felt like if she hadn't had that abortion, that it would have destroyed her life because she was in an abusive relationship. And I think that what I take from that as a Republican who proudly wants to protect innocent life in this country, who proudly wants to protect the vulnerable, is that my party, we've got to do so much better of a job at earning the American people's trust back on this issue where they frankly just don't trust us. And I think that's one of the things that Donald Trump and I are endeavoring to do. I want us as a Republican Party to be pro-family in the fullest sense of the word. I want us to support fertility treatments. I want us to make it easier for moms to afford to have babies. I want it to make it easier for young families to afford a home so they can afford a place to raise that family. And I think there's so much that we can do on the public policy front just to give women more options. Now, of course, Donald Trump has been very clear that on the abortion policy specifically, that we have a big country and it's diverse. And California has a different viewpoint on this than Georgia. Georgia has a different viewpoint from Arizona. And the proper way to handle this, as messy as democracy sometimes is to let voters make these decisions, let the individual states make their abortion policy. And I think that's what makes the most sense in a very big, a very diverse, and let's be honest, sometimes a very, very messy and divided country.
I mean, Matt, that seems to kind of get exactly into what you were talking about before. I mean, you and I are both old enough to remember Republican politicians 10 years ago, 15 years ago, 20 years ago, whatever, being able to make a case, I guess, for why they would favor, striking down a row, for why they would favor certain bans on abortion, certain restrictions on abortion, even a federal level, heartbeat bill, something like that. I don't think I ever heard a politician, certainly not at the level that J.D. Vance is now, as the nominee for vice president for his party, basically saying exactly what you were saying. We know the hardships, we understand the hardships that can come in some of these situations, and that's what we want to try to get at. And I mean, again, it gets back into what you were saying before. Just, I don't know, do you think that's the kind of message in the political arena, at least, that might end up sticking around, whatever happens after this election, after November 5th, 2024?
Yeah, I think that's a masterful answer by J.D. Vance. I mean, talking directly to all Americans, he's asking for everybody's vote, and he recognizes there's deep difference and disagreement on this issue, and he's accommodating those who disagree with pro-life positions. It's a masterclass from my standpoint in how pro-lifers, I think, in this environment should talk about some of those types of questions. I do think it's really fascinating that he has shifted to pro-family policies, and this came out in there was a proposal that Katie Britt and Ted Cruz co-sponsored to protect in vitro fertilization earlier this fall, and they wrote a Wall Street Journal article as it was announced, describing it as a pro-family policy. And that subtle shift among social conservatives from pro-life to pro-family says a lot about what they're trying to do, right? They want to protect fertility treatments, which in the pro-life community is massively controversial, I think, for very good reasons. I've written publicly in a variety of places about why I think in vitro fertilization is morally wrong. I've not taken up the policy questions around it per se, but in vitro fertilization raises a whole number of moral questions, and pro-lifers institutionally, the institutional pro-lifers are almost completely opposed to in vitro fertilization. The actual people in the pews or out in society who call themselves pro-life have very few objections to in vitro fertilization. So there's zero loss politically with the pro-life voter for J.D. Vance to make that shift from pro-life to pro-family. He's not going to lose any votes because of in vitro fertilization. But what he's going to do is he's going to make it palatable for the working class voter to vote for him. And he's going to reduce, I think, some of the stigma for the middle class, probably male, who is inclined to vote for Donald Trump. I don't think he's going to get the middle class women, because middle class women, the hostility to Trump is so deep and so baked in. But for middle class men to be able to say, look, their position on abortion isn't quite as extreme as you think. Like it's a really savvy political approach, I think. And it's inevitable to me that given the conditions, given the constraints, that's where the pro-life movement needs to be at these days.
Mm-hmm. At the risk of going down a rabbit trail, on the question of IVF, you said that you believe it raises particular moral questions and is problematic. Can you give us just an overview, or I don't know, feel free to go a little bit deeper too, what those questions are, what those problems are? I think even observing conversations among serious people and among people of good faith, it's very hard to think of a conversation I've seen about the moral correctness of in vitro fertilization. It's very hard to think of a conversation that goes well and that doesn't quickly kind of turn into kind of just people talking past one another because of their own personal experiences. So I just wonder if you'd be willing to give a stab at outlining what these questions are and kind of taking us down that path a little bit.
I've already made myself so popular, Michael. You just want me to carry on making myself the most beloved man in America. No, I do.
Ingratiate yourself to the people.
That's right. I make friends. So there's a variety of concerns that one could have. The most immediate, the concern that most pro-lifers have out of the gate is the inevitable death and destruction of embryos that is accompanied in the process, that seems to be baked in to the process of in vitro fertilization. Right? When you have human beings created in the lab, some of those are going to be of better or worse quality, quote unquote. They're going to be assigned scores, for instance, on viability. And in most cases, the most viable embryos will be transferred first. And what that often leads to is extra embryos that have been created that you have to do something with, right? Indefinite storage, which is what most people opt for, is not a just condition for a human being, right? There's nothing just about humans being stored in nitrogen forever and ever. It seems intrinsically, I think it's intrinsically denigrating to human beings to not give them an opportunity to live. And so there's all sorts of problems in the production of embryos that I think come along with in vitro fertilization. But then you can raise questions too about what type of control over fertility we're seeking to have. What sort of notion of medicine is baked into in vitro fertilization? It's non-therapeutic, so it doesn't actually heal or cure the individuals who, for whatever reason, are not conceiving a child. It sidesteps their reproductive systems. And it brings about a child, which is something they desire, but it's a notion of medicine where the end of medicine is helping people get what they desire and not actually creating the conditions for the systems, the organic systems, the part of their bodies to work correctly. And so I think there's a fundamentally embedded in the process a different view of medicine, and I think that there's also it changes the way in which we think about pregnancy and procreation. It inherently pathologizes infertility. It means that infertility is intrinsically, inherently a kind of disease that can be cured by medicine rather than just maybe luck, right? Like you can imagine two very healthy people who, for whatever reason, the gods, or I think God, just doesn't decide to bring a child into that couple's life. Once you have in vitro fertilization, it inherently reduces that process to a matter of disease. And it creates a sense of like couples who think they have a right to have children as a result. So there's all sorts of ways in which I think the fertility industry and in vitro fertilization reshape people's perspectives of procreation, of parenting, of medicine. But none of that, I mean, so there's the moral case. There's zero political will to do anything about that, right? Absolutely none. In fact, all the political will is protecting, preserving, ensuring that people have access to these treatments, because people desperately do want children, and because 40 to 50% of the time they might actually bring about a child, and that's a decent odds, right? So there's no political will. So everything I said, like if you're interested in the politics of these issues, just discount it. Like I'm a weirdo. I have my weird little views, and I don't plan on ever doing anything about it or seeing anything done in my lifetime about it. It's just a non-starter.
Yeah. I mean, I think you're right about that. I guess my question, and it kind of goes back to my first question to you. I mean, should a kind of fully throated pro-life movement be dealing with those particular questions, or is that just so far outside of what's practical in the moment that it's just not even worth thinking about right now?
I think a fully throated pro-life movement should be counseling, providing opportunities for couples who are infertile to reflect on the ethics of in vitro fertilization, and challenging our social beliefs around what in vitro fertilization does, what it leads to. I think we can't shy away from that. I do think that the vision of in vitro fertilization, the vision of the embryo in that context, challenges certain presuppositions that have been very effective in the fight against abortion. Right. So one of the things I have an essay as of yet unpublished, probably never will be published, where I say something like, look, in the fight against abortion, the rhetoric of the individual child having a right to life has been very effective, right? Life begins at conception. Every human being has a right to life. And that argument depends upon theorizing, conceptualizing the embryo as, in a certain respect, an independent person from the mother, right? I think that that's true, even while the embryo in pregnancy is in a very weird condition, right? Like, let's just be honest. There's no other time in which human beings are wholly within the body of another human being. So the notion of independence in that case has to be, I think, very carefully circumscribed and qualified. If you think about the embryo in IVF, the embryo in IVF is fully independent, right? Not in the womb. Has, like, it's the archetype, if you will, of an independent being that has a right. And so in one respect, all the rhetoric that has been useful in persuading people to not go for abortion is also conducive to making them think that in vitro fertilization is fine, because we're creating independent beings that have rights to life. So what's the problem, right? And the whole question is, what's the nature of human life? What's the good of human life? Right. Not only in its embryonic condition, but its embryonic condition is conceived within the womb of a woman. Like, what's the good of that? And how do we have policies that acknowledge that very complicated reality? That I think is, from my standpoint, a conceptual question that the pro-life movement has not adequately answered, and that is the question that it has to face for both abortion and in vitro fertilization policy for the next 50 years.
So you've written for us that I don't have the quote pulled up in front of me, but I think what you wrote was akin to, one of the best things that the pro-life movement can do right now is to trust the political instincts of Donald J. Trump.
I might have said that. That's true.
I think, the first time I read that in the draft, my head tilted off its axis a little bit. And I wonder if some of our readers did too.
Is that the nicest thing that's been said about Donald J. Trump in the Dispatch ever?
Yeah, it's right up there, buddy. I'll tell you that. We are aware of who we are. No, but I mean, like, when everything you just said about what is the good of human life, and what is human life, and what is how independent is an embryo in the womb or outside the womb, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, all those kind of questions sort of fade away in the naked light that politics cast down on the whole thing. And so
Absolutely.
you wrote that one of the best things the pro-life movement could do is to follow the political instincts of Donald J. Trump. And I guess, I mean, in July, you had the Republican Party change its platform to go the streamlined, kind of bare bones version of what it had been, and removed a lot of the meat that had been present in it for well nigh 40 years, right? Since Ronald Reagan was a political force. And you had some folks in the pro-life movement kind of react viscerally. You pointed out a lot of them will get in line because, when faced with, if you look at the election as only a choice between Donald Trump and now Kamala Harris, the ledger is still this way on Donald Trump and this way on Kamala Harris. I mean, what do you think the lasting effects of that might be politically? And do you think, you've written that this is a time to kind of reset the politics and reimagine what the pro-life movement does politically. I guess, what does that actually look like spelled out, be it policy, be it on the level of, you've also written, we shouldn't be given over to kind of the canard that we just have to go back to persuading hearts and minds.
Yeah.
That sort of thing. What does it actually look like for a reset to take place and to be effective, I guess?
Yeah, it's a good question. I'm not sure I have a good answer to it. This is where I think what I would like to do is sit in a room with a bunch of people who really disagree with me and people who do policy on a day-to-day basis and think with them about what the limits and what the possibilities of policy are in this sort of political environment. It seems to me that when it comes to, there's people who disagree with me who can point to the fact that, for instance, pro-life politicians have not been punished as politicians for enacting pro-life policies since Dobbs came, right? So Ron DeSantis in Florida, has a sort of passes limits and wins re-election, he's fine. And I think that that's really significant and really important data. I think what it indicates is that when pro-life positions are bundled in voters' minds with thriving economic conditions, with, other concerns that are more important to them, they don't mind, right? They're not going to object as strongly to restrictions if those restrictions are accompanied by security at the border and the possibility of putting food on their table for their family because inflation is low. And so I think insofar as the pro-life movement resets itself, I think it really has to think about how it is able to bundle policies in light of other types of concerns, which is I take what I take the JD Vance strategy to be, right? We're going to talk about being pro-family. We're going to talk about sort of paid family leave. We're going to talk about these types of concerns or these types of policies. And, if it comes down to it, we might also include some restrictions, maybe if we could, if the wind blows our ways. But if we accompany these no's with these yeses, these things that we're doing positively, it's going to be much more palatable to the American public. And so I think the pro-life movement needs to think, what are the positive things that we can do to alleviate pressure on working class women so that they're comfortable having more children? Because if people have lots of money, if they're stable economically, they're comfortable having more children, right? Desired fertility in this country is not where actual fertility is, right?
Mm-hmm.
People desire more children right now than they're actually having. And some of that is the gap, like the money it takes to pay for extra children. They don't have it. They don't feel secure enough. And so if we can close that gap, we could potentially have a better environment in which pro-life arguments could take hold than we have at present. That's a non-answer to your question, Michael. But I'm a professor, and so I'm not a political strategist, and I'm not an expert, and like there's so many people inside the movement that would disagree with me and know more than me on this, and I just want to acknowledge that.
Sure. No, that's all fair. I mean, to go back to professorial roots for a second, I mean, one of the things you did write about that I think is important in the whole conversation too is the lengths to which the law can go. And I mean, we've talked about this already, and we've kind of talked around it too. Just the electorate, the American public, is just not where the pro-life movement is in terms of the moral calculation on some of these questions, right?
Yep.
I think you refer to it in your writing, but I've heard it referred to before. You have too, that sometimes the law can help shape those sorts of things. Everyone points back to the civil rights movement, right?
Yeah.
You and I had conversations about that. The civil rights movement brought about more positive change just by virtue of enacting certain laws at a certain time than would have happened naturally on their own, particularly in the South, obviously. But you also, have written about, and you refer back to Thomas Aquinas, the limits of legislation, the limits the law can go to in kind of shaping consciences and, shaping hearts and minds, to kind of put it that way. And I guess, where do you draw the line in terms of maintaining that balance? I mean, there's this natural tension there of wanting to pass laws that you think are reflective of, moral truths, moral certainties, but knowing that if you go too far, and maybe this is what we're seeing in some of these referenda in the last 2.5 years across the country, it can have kind of an opposite reaction on the society as a whole, or on a community as a whole. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, the more restrictive your laws, the more likely the backlash is. Yeah, that's especially true, I think, in an American context where Americans are, as I said earlier, particularly prone to cherish our liberties. And so laws that really restrict those liberties, we're going to recoil against instinctively. I think, like, if I'm just putting hard questions out for the pro-life movement, as we think about legislation, as we think about reducing abortions in this country, I think there's a question that the pro-life movement has to answer, which is how many early term abortions are we willing to countenance or forbear for the sake of significantly reducing abortion access in this country? If I gave you a 0.1% chance of making abortion unthinkable in this country, or I gave you a 90% chance of not making abortion unthinkable, but constraining its scope to very few early abortions, which one would you choose? Right? The rhetoric of the pro-life movement around we're going to make abortion unthinkable, we're going to get to zero abortions in this country, politically, I think actually harms its decision making, because it sets up a threshold for success that, as we get closer to, would require more and more restrictive legislation and would actually create the conditions for backlash and make us less successful. And so being, I hate it, but really realist about how many abortions are going to happen in this country, like over some, period of time where it's going to be a permanent reality. We're not going to be able to get to abortion zero, but we might be able to seriously reduce it. I think actually being really realistic about that would help us come up with ways of speaking about abortion that are closer to what JD Vance is doing, which is reaching out to people and trying to persuade them and move them closer to our view. Because what people are terrified right now about is getting to abortion zero and all of the social costs that it would take to do that. right? And the longer people are terrified about that, the worse the backlash against our position is going to be, and the farther away from our goal of ending abortion we will be, right? Like that's so it's this weird paradox where our rhetoric around our ideals, I think, is actually not conducive to our political success and moving us closer to those ideals. And I don't know what to do about that, because you can't, like, my question, right? Getting to abortion very few as a goal rather than abortion zero, that raises $0 from donors, right? No one's enthusiastic about my question. There's just no win for a social movement by having realistic aspirations in that way. And you can say, well, we sort of say our ideals and raise all the money, and like in private we're more realistic. And so, but I actually think my impression of the way in which pro-life movement's political dimension has gone is that's not the case, right? It's when I talk with people who are really invested in pro-life politics, and I say, like, have you considered the possibility that for 30 years, we might just have to forbear some number of abortions in order to, 30 years from now, have the social conditions to make abortion significantly less? That's a thought they're just not willing to entertain. And that to me is a problem. And I get it. I'm a professor, right? Like this isn't my day job. And so I'm not dependent upon fundraising for these sorts of things. But I actually think these conditions are not conducive to our success. And I would like to see abortions reduced to almost zero in this country for 100 years, right? Forever. But I think in order to get there, we might have to rethink how we're talking about and what we're actually aiming at as a movement.
I mean, as you, as you kind of unpack that, I like the analogy that came to mind is just the former option, the getting to abortion zero almost seems like a utopianism of abortion, if that makes sense. A seeking the perfect when it's just not feasible. I don't know if you'd agree with that kind of.
Yep, that's exactly right. Yep.
Like,
and on poverty, there's people on the right who will say very quickly, and I don't like this line. I don't think this line is good, right? But if you want to talk about eliminating poverty in America, they'll come back at you and like, well, Jesus says the poor you will always have with you. So we shouldn't try to eliminate poverty entirely because the social costs of doing so, the economic costs of doing so would just be way too high. We can't sustain it. If you say that sort of thing about abortion, people cannot fathom. And I get they're different issues, right? One is a killing, one is not. But if you really want to win over the long term and seriously reduce abortion, I don't know what else to do.
Yeah. Matt, anything else? Talked about a couple different facets here, but anything else to throw in about the entire issue, or just why you're not a heretic for saying that?
I'm looking at you like, no, don't let me say anything else. Cut me off. Don't know. I really appreciate you having me on to think about these things. You know, I'm grateful.
Where can folks find you and find your work if they want to keep following you?
Yeah, I have a Substack. The easiest place to look is MatthewLeeAnderson.com. I'm on Twitter at Matt Lee Anderson, but I'm not there now, and I won't be there until January of this next year. I'm on hiatus. So if you hated what you heard, or if you maybe were intrigued by it, MatthewLeeAnderson.com. You can see my newsletter there and drop me a line. I read all my mail.
It's good stuff, and he does read all his mail. I can vouch for that, since you've responded to completely random emails from me over the last year, coming out of nowhere. Matt, thanks so much for taking the time. Appreciate it. Appreciate your thinking. Appreciate your work.